Mike Johnson believed he could lecture Jasmine Crockett about constitutional law on live air. What transpired next rendered the House Speaker dumbfounded and may have delivered the most devastating political takedown of 2025. The strongest Republican in the House of Representatives. A man who has built his entire political identity around constitutional knowledge. Sitting in stunned silence while a first-term Congresswoman demolishes every legal point he's presented. The cameras caught every moment of his humiliation, and the internet is poised to erupt. The moment when a seasoned Texas lawyer exposed the Speaker's constitutional incompetence in front of millions of Americans is about to be recorded in political history. But before we get into how Jasmine Crockett just destroyed Mike Johnson's credibility with one superb legal argument, let's take a deeper look at the characters involved in this epic clash. This wasn't simply another political debate. It was a demonstration of how preparation, legal expertise, and unwavering determination can completely demolish even the most powerful adversaries. Johnson stepped into that hearing chamber expecting to simply answer any questions about his contentious emergency powers measure. Instead, he went out, looking like a law student who had just failed his final test in front of the whole class. And Johnson's expression at the end was pure political catastrophe. The kind of moment that ends careers and makes legends. We're talking about a constitutional expert who was so thoroughly educated that even his Republican colleagues couldn't defend him. The aftermath is still causing shockwaves in Washington. And you're going to discover why. On one side, we have Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, constitutional lawyer, and Louisiana Republican who has been in politics for decades. He's used to being the brightest guy in the room, lecturing people on the Constitution and legal precedent. Johnson established his reputation as a constitutional scholar long before entering politics, when he worked as a lawyer for the Alliance Defending Freedom, arguing religious liberty matters in federal courts. His ascent to the position of Speaker was no accident. Republicans recruited him expressly for his legal credentials and alleged constitutional competence. He'd written numerous legal briefs, taught constitutional law seminars, and established himself as the party's go-to source on constitutional issues. Johnson's colleagues frequently deferred to his legal opinions, and he had grown accustomed to being the last word on constitutional interpretation in Republican circles. He was the one you went to for answers, and he helped develop party policy on constitutional problems. Johnson approached this hearing with his typical assurance. He'd done his studies, prepared his talking points, and anticipated to be able to handle whatever came his way. After all, he is the Speaker. He has complete control over the agenda, schedule, and flow of House business. More importantly, he truly thought that his legal analysis was flawless. His staff had produced substantial briefing documents, and he believed many constitutional law experts had examined his argument. When it came to constitutional law, Johnson was the unchallenged expert in his circle. He could recite case law from memory, cite historical precedents, and make compelling arguments that garnered him the respect of his colleagues. He believed he was prepared for this hearing. But here's the thing with overconfidence: it frequently blinds you to the unexpected. On the other side, you have Jasmine Crockett, a first-term congressman from Texas, a former public defender, and civil rights attorney who has spent her career fighting for justice in courtrooms around the country. But calling her a rookie would be an understatement. Crockett graduated from the University of Houston Law Center, where she worked as editor of the Houston Law Review. She then worked as a public defender for years, litigating some of the most challenging constitutional matters in Texas federal courts. Her legal career has been highlighted by triumphs in instances involving Fourth Amendment violations, due process rights, and equal protection claims. She had argued several times before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals and had never lost a constitutional law motion in federal court. While Johnson gave political speeches about the Constitution, Crockett litigated and won constitutional cases. She wasn't just another politician reading from a script. She was a practicing attorney with extensive experience in constitutional law. While Johnson was developing a political brand, Crockett was mastering the precise legal concepts that Johnson had built his career on. However, Johnson was unaware of the following. Crockett had been prepared for this moment for several weeks. While he was preoccupied with party politics and media appearances, she was delving into constitutional law, examining precedents, and developing a watertight legal argument that would expose the underlying weaknesses in Johnson's position. Crockett was not simply reading the legislation, she was internalizing it. She refused to let Johnson's political maneuvers damage constitutional norms. The stakes could not have been higher. This was about more than just one bill or vote. This was about the future of constitutional interpretation, whether political convenience could trump legal precedent, and whether a first-term Congresswoman could challenge the most powerful Republican in the House. The topic at hand was Johnson's contentious interpretation of emergency powers during the ongoing border crisis. He had been pursuing a bill that many legal experts claimed violated separation of powers principles. Critics claimed it was unlawful, but Johnson disregarded them as partisan attacks. What he didn't expect was someone with Crockett's legal experience to meticulously dissect his constitutional reasoning on live air. This law was viewed as a potential abuse of executive authority and a risky step toward upsetting the balance of power between the branches of government. Critics from both parties had expressed worries, but Johnson dismissed them, believing that his legal expertise would protect him from any serious difficulties. He didn't aware Crockett was preparing to offer that challenge. The setting was set for a duel between political might and legal competence, with only one of them able to maintain their credibility. The hearing began normally enough. Johnson, who chairs the committee, began with his typical statements on border security and constitutional duties. His words had the typical tone of authority, the confidence of someone who has never been challenged on constitutional issues. The first few questions came from sympathetic Republicans, who asked easy questions that allowed Johnson to elaborate on his talking points. He mentioned founding fathers, cited historical precedents, and spoke with the confidence of someone who truly believed the law was on his side. Johnson was doing what he had always done, speaking with authority, confident that the law would back him up. The Democrats then took their turn asking questions. A few members raised pointed questions regarding presidential overreach and the separation of powers, but Johnson handled them well. He definitely anticipated these common complaints. The gentle lady from California doesn't seem to understand the difference between emergency powers and executive overreach, Johnson added with a little smirk, eliciting laughter from his Republican colleagues. He leaned back in his chair, exuding the nonchalant assurance of someone who has faced thousands of similar obstacles in his career. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez attempted to challenge Mike Johnson on the possibility of abuse of emergency powers, but he quickly disregarded her worries with an almost dismissive wave of his hand. The Congresswoman's fears are unfounded, Johnson remarked, his voice full of confidence. We have built-in safeguards and judicial oversight mechanisms that prevent any constitutional overreach. His smirk widened as he continued, citing the Supreme Court's judgment in Dames and Moore v. Reagan to support his position on the executive's authority during times of crisis. His remarks echoed across the chamber, but it was evident to everyone there that Johnson was considerably more at ease as the teacher than the pupil. As he talked, the Democratic committee members were obviously irritated. One could almost see the wheels spinning in their heads as they searched for a new angle of attack. But Johnson was in his element, answering questions with the ease of someone who had been giving this speech for decades. His legal arguments, while potentially weak, were immaculate in his own opinion, and his continual stream of citations appeared to give a bulletproof defense. The Democrats' fury was palpable in the room, but Johnson, seemingly impervious to challenge, went ahead. He was the speaker, after all, and the guy in command. However, as the debates became increasingly heated, one individual stayed strangely silent. Jasmine Crockett, a freshman representative from Texas, had been sitting back and taking precise notes on everything Johnson said. Crockett did not raise broad political questions as the rest of the committee struggled to find their footing. Instead, she was examining Johnson's legal citations and cross-referencing them with her own study. She was a lawyer, a seasoned litigator with years of experience in federal court, and she recognized the flaws in Johnson's arguments before anybody else. Crockett's reactions to each scenario given by Johnson were minor yet telling. She sat up a little straighter once he said Youngstown Steel. When he mentioned ex parte Milligan, her brow furrowed slightly, and when he quoted Korematsu, she shook her head faintly. These were not the actions of someone who was intimidated by Johnson's extensive knowledge. No, Crockett was a professional attorney, a courtroom warrior, and she saw an opportunity, a flaw in Johnson's legal thinking just waiting to be exploited. The mood in the room began to alter, and even the Republican members appeared to notice. Something was building, with the potential to change the course of this entire hearing. Johnson, still full of confidence, was unaware that his legal fortress was disintegrating before his eyes. When it was finally her turn to speak, Crockett wasted no time. She rose up slowly and calmly, but with the distinct air of someone about to change the course of history. Mr. Speaker, she started, her voice clean and steady but with an edge that caused everyone in the room to sit up straight. I've been listening to your constitutional arguments with great interest, but as a former public defender who spent years in federal court, I have to say, I'm confused by some of your legal reasoning. There it was. The first weakness in Johnson's armor. His smile faltered just slightly. This was not the tone he was used to hearing from rookie members, especially one on the other side of the aisle. Crockett's comments were measured, but they had a weight that Johnson did not anticipate. If the gentle lady has specific questions about constitutional law, I'm happy to educate her, Johnson said, returning to his authoritative, even patronizing tone. The word educate hung in the air like an invitation, a challenge. Crockett's eyes brightened up. This was just the opportunity she had been hoping for. She had finished her homework. She knew the law inside and out. Now it was time for her to put Johnson in his place. "Oh, Mr. Speaker," she said, her voice still courteous but firm enough to make everyone in the room pay attention. "I think there might be some confusion about who needs educating here." The room went completely silent. Even the Republican members paused their side chats, and all eyes were focused on Crockett. The normal partisan wrangling had subsided. What was about to happen was not your typical back and forth. It was a battle, and Crockett was clearly ready to deliver a crushing legal blow. "You see," Crockett continued, fully commanding the audience's attention, "you've used Youngstown Steel 3 times in your arguments today. But I don't think you've studied the case, because if you did, you'd realize that undermines your entire viewpoint." Johnson's face started to twitch. He attempted to interject, but Crockett was not having it. She had come prepared, and she was not going to let him deflect with political rhetoric. "No, Mr. Speaker," she said, pulling out a huge folder of documents. "I've written a detailed study of each constitutional precedent you've mentioned today. And, Mr. Speaker, with all due respect, you've gotten practically every one of them wrong." The tension in the room was apparent. Republican members moved uncomfortably in their seats, while Democrats, now fully aware that something monumental was happening, leaned forward, eager to see where this was leading. Johnson's usual unshakable confidence was beginning to wane. The man who had been the center of legal authority in the room for so long was obviously shaken. "Now," Crockett said, her voice rising firmer, "I could go through each case individually, but I think it would be more efficient to focus on the fundamental constitutional principle you seem to have forgotten." She rose up, documents in hand, and approached the podium. The cameras tracked her every movement. This was no longer a routine hearing. This was a historic moment, one that would define not only the hearing, but maybe the whole political year. "Mr. Speaker," she said, "you've based your entire argument on the assumption that emergency powers transcend constitutional constraints, but that's not how our system works. It has never worked that way. And if you'd truly looked into the examples you've been mentioning, you'd know." Johnson's confidence was utterly gone. He attempted to speak, but Crockett lifted her hand, indicating that she was not finished. "I'm not finished, Mr. Speaker," she stated forcefully, and everyone in the room felt the weight of her words. "You wanted to educate me on constitutional law. Class is now in session." With that, Jasmine Crockett began dismantling Johnson's legal arguments with surgical accuracy. "Let's start with Youngstown Steel," she remarked, her voice full of power as if she knew she was about to deliver a legal knockout. "In Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company v. Sawyer, the Supreme Court emphatically rejected the notion that emergency powers grant the executive branch limitless discretion. Justice Jackson's concurring opinion, which serves as the framework for separation of powers analysis, really supports the contrary of what you're suggesting." She stopped, allowing the words to sink in, before continuing. "You used this instance to justify emergency executive action. But, Mr. Speaker, this judgment literally declared emergency presidential action unlawful. How would you explain the contradiction?" Johnson was stunned. He muttered something about diverse interpretations, but Crockett was not going to let him off the hook. "Are there different interpretations?" she said, her voice harsh with incredulity. "Mr. Speaker, this is not an interpretation issue. This is an issue of fundamental legal literacy. The case states the exact reverse of what you allege it does." Crockett opened her folder and brought out more paperwork while the room was utterly silent. "Now, let's discuss Ex parte Milligan, another case you mentioned today. You used it to argue that wartime emergency powers justify ignoring standard constitutional safeguards. However, Mr. Speaker, that ruling plainly establishes that the Constitution cannot be suspended, even during wartime crises." She read verbatim from her notes. "The Constitution of the United States is a law for rulers and people equally in war and peace." Johnson's expression was now one of surprise and astonishment. His typical swagger was vanished, and he was left floundering on live television, absolutely vulnerable. "Are you familiar with that portion of the decision?" Crockett inquired, her voice calm, but the gravity of her query was clear. Johnson's mouth opened and closed like a fish panting for oxygen. He gave no response. The reality was too obvious to deny. During the heated argument, Mike Johnson began to respond, attempting to explain his constitutional rationale. But before he could finish his sentence, Jasmine Crockett cut him off. "The context, Mr. Speaker," she continued, her voice calm but with an evident edge, "is that you're referencing cases you've never studied to defend viewpoints they really oppose. That is not constitutional law. That is constitutional malpractice." The words echoed through the room like a bombshell. The camera focused on Johnson's face, recording every detail of his growing shame. It was almost weird to see a man who had built his whole career around constitutional law, one of the most powerful characters in American politics, being lectured by a first-term Congresswoman. And this wasn't just any discussion. The Speaker of the House was publicly exposed for either ignorance or purposeful distortion of the Constitution, which he had pledged to defend. As Crockett talked, the attitude in the room changed. What began as a normal hearing quickly became a courtroom drama. Even Johnson, who had entered the room with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to being the brightest person in the room, now appeared to be a law student caught off guard by a question he had not studied for. The entire room, both Republicans and Democrats, watched Crockett execute each sentence with accuracy, her legal mind destroying his arguments one by one. Crockett was still not finished. She was building to her crescendo, which everyone could feel coming. Mr. Speaker, you graduated from law school. You've practiced law. You have taught constitutional law. How is it possible that you do not comprehend these fundamental constitutional principles? She inquired, pausing for emphasis. Her eyes focused on Johnson's, and her intensity was undeniable. Unless you do understand them, and you're deliberately misrepresenting them to advance a political agenda that you know is unconstitutional. The accusation landed like a thunderclap. Crockett had just suggested live on national television that Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, was either absolutely incompetent or purposefully misrepresenting the law to advance his political objective. There was no more middle ground. The moment was clear. Johnson was either unaware of constitutional law or was lying to the American people. Johnson's expression changed as the gravity of the situation hit in. Shock, rage, desperation, and eventually resignation. The Speaker of the House, whose legal reasoning had gone unchallenged for years, had now been exposed in front of millions of Americans. Crockett had cornered him, leaving no way out. His face turned pale, and his normal confidence gone. Johnson muttered, just above a whisper, "I think we should move on to other questions." But Crockett wasn't about to let him go that easy. She had already delivered the initial blow, and now she was going to drive it home. "Oh no, Mr. Speaker," she said forcefully, her tone unwavering. "You wanted to educate me on constitutional law. I believe that the American people need to hear your reaction to these anomalies. How do you justify citing cases that contradict your own arguments?" The room was now completely still. Johnson, who had been in command minutes earlier, found himself immobilized and unable to react. The stillness went on, and Crockett's words lingered heavy in the air. He shuffled his notes, looked everywhere except at Crockett and the cameras. His desperation was evident. He knew he'd been apprehended. Whether via ignorance or deception, he was now exposed. After a few moments of awkward silence, Johnson murmured something about conferring with legal counsel and hastily requested a recess. But the harm was done. In less than 15 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had entirely undermined Mike Johnson's credibility in constitutional law. She had exposed his legal arguments as fundamentally wrong, and she did it with such accuracy and power that even his Republican colleagues were unable to defend him. As Johnson left the hearing room, Crockett stayed at the podium, sorting her documents with the calm pleasure of a lawyer who had just won the most important case of her career. The look on her face said it all: mission completed. The fallout from this confrontation was unlike anything political analysts had seen in years. The hearing chamber devolved into mayhem as reporters rushed to submit breaking news articles and congressional workers scrambled to phone their supervisors to report what had occurred. Within minutes of a short recess, social media was flooded with emotions, analysis, and quick criticism. What many were already describing as the most devastating political takedown in recent memory spread rapidly. Twitter's algorithms struggled to keep up with the volume of messages about the fight. The hashtag Crockett Schools Johnson rapidly became the most popular subject, followed by hashtag Constitutional Masterclass and hashtag Speaker Meltdown. Within the first hour, thousands of people had shared the video of Johnson's astonished silence. TikTok users began making split-screen videos featuring Johnson's strong beginning words and his surprised, speechless reaction at the end. Political Twitter was on fire, with responses pouring in from all sides. However, it was not limited to partisan reactions. Legal experts from throughout the country weighed in, and they all agreed, Crockett was correct. Johnson's legal reasoning had been fundamentally defective, and it was exposed for all to see. Professor Lawrence Tribe, a distinguished Harvard law professor, provided a detailed thread going out each of Crockett's assertions, closing with Republic. Crockett just gave the most accurate constitutional analysis I have heard in Congress in years. Every statement was legally sound and devastatingly true. Within 3 hours, his thread had been retweeted 50,000 times. Professor Neil Katyal, former acting Solicitor General, also commented, saying, "This is what happens when someone who actually knows constitutional law meets someone who only pretends to know it." Brutal and beautiful. Even conservative legal professors, who typically support Johnson, found themselves unable to defend his claims. The reactions were not restricted to legal scholars. Everyday Americans were sharing the videos, amazed at Crockett's performance. "I don't know much about constitutional law, but I know what getting schooled looks like," stated one viral tweet, which rapidly received over 100,000 likes. Another tweet read, "Jasmine Crockett just demonstrated what real expertise looks like. This is why we need more attorneys, rather than politicians, in Congress." The mainstream media quickly caught on. CNN's legal commentator Jeffrey Toobin described it as one of the most impressive displays of constitutional knowledge I've ever seen from a member of Congress. MSNBC ran the clips repeatedly, with constitutional professors adding extra background, making Johnson look even worse. Even Fox News, which is normally supportive of Republican leadership, had to admit the reality of the situation. Their legal analyst, Andrew Napolitano, stated on the air, "Regardless of party politics, Representative Crockett was absolutely correct on the law. The Speaker's constitutional argument was clearly wrong." But maybe the most striking responses came from within Congress. Many Republican members in that hearing chamber were fully aware of what they had just witnessed. Many others privately expressed concern about Johnson's leadership and whether they could continue to back him on constitutional grounds. An anonymous Republican aide told Politico, "We've always assumed the Speaker knew what he was talking about on constitutional matters. After today, we're not sure about anything." Democrats, on the other hand, were publicly praising Crockett's performance. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries praised her for her outstanding legal insight and unwavering commitment to constitutional ideals. Representative Crockett demonstrated today why we need more legal experts and fewer political hacks in positions of power, Mr. Jeffries added. Her mastery of constitutional law was evident to everyone watching. The day Jasmine Crockett defeated Mike Johnson in that hearing would go down in history. It was an excellent demonstration of how one lawyer, armed with knowledge and drive, could completely demolish the legal arguments of the most powerful guy in Congress. What began as a basic hearing quickly became a seismic political moment, shaping the destiny of American constitutional discussions for years to come. The repercussions of this incident went far beyond a single hearing or Mike Johnson's personal disgrace. Jasmine Crockett had not only exposed a temporary mistake in judgment or a political blunder, she had busted a basic flaw in how many politicians approached constitutional interpretation. For far too long, the Constitution was regarded not as a serious legal document, but as a political tool, an instrument to be exploited and misused for political gain rather than as a guiding force in American administration. Crockett's performance went beyond simply breaking down Johnson's arguments. It broke down the dominant tendency in Washington, where politicians frequently recite constitutional words for effect without truly grasping the ideals they claim to defend. Legal scholars across the country immediately grasped the gravity of the situation. The entire session became a teaching moment, demonstrating the difference between what constitutional understanding should look like and the hazardous exploitation of legal precedents for political convenience. Law schools around the country began incorporating the tape into their constitutional law lectures, using Crockett's queries and Johnson's responses to demonstrate both the strength of legal reasoning and the perilous consequences of constitutional ignorance. However, the political repercussions were equally severe. Johnson's credibility as a constitutional authority was irreparably harmed, but the ramifications extended far beyond his personal shame. Within hours of the hearing, senior Republican members, who had previously trusted Johnson's legal knowledge, began privately doubting his leadership on legal issues. Senator Ted Cruz, a constitutional lawyer himself, was allegedly taken aback by Johnson's performance and raised concern about the party's trustworthiness on constitutional issues. The House Republican Conference had an emergency meeting the next day. According to multiple sources, there were heated discussions on Johnson's constitutional competency. Representative Chip Roy, known for his own constitutional advocacy, was alleged to have questioned Johnson's ability to continue leading on legal issues in light of the recent public and court drubbing he had received. In the aftermath, the conference opted to limit Johnson's role in constitutional debates by appointing a team of lawyers to assess all future legal views. The Speaker, once a towering figure in the Republican Party, now finds himself sidelined on constitutional issues. Meanwhile, the Democrats took advantage of the opportunity to position Crockett as a constitutional leader. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries quickly appointed Crockett to the House Judiciary Committee and announced that she would chair a new Democratic task force on constitutional oversight. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, DCCC, began featuring Crockett in fundraising materials, referring to her as the constitutional champion Democrats have been waiting for. This was more than a political victory, it was a reshaping of the leadership dynamic in Congress, with Crockett emerging as a new beacon of legal expertise and authority. But, perhaps most importantly, the confrontation marked a generational shift in how constitutional law was debated in Congress. Crockett, representing a new generation of legal brains in politics, demonstrated that experience and preparedness could still triumph over political posturing and meaningless bluster. She had demonstrated, with surgical precision, that constitutional law cannot be reduced to sound bites. It requires a thorough grasp, meticulous study, and a devotion to the Constitution's integrity. This was a wake-up call for both sides of the aisle, reminding them that the Constitution could no longer be considered as a political chess piece to be pushed around for short-term gain. Law schools around the country began to attract more minority constitutional scholars, inspired by Crockett's example of bringing sophisticated legal analysis into the political debate. Students, particularly those from marginalized backgrounds, began to realize that a career in law did not have to be limited to working in law firms. It could also involve making a difference in the larger political scene. The bigger message struck a chord with Americans, who were becoming tired of politicians talking about the Constitution without actually comprehending it. Morning Consult polling in the week following the hearing found that 73% of Americans agreed that elected officials should be forced to pass a basic constitutional literacy exam before joining office. Surprisingly, 68% of Republicans supported this proposition, indicating that even Johnson's own party was concerned about the level of constitutional competency in leadership. The polling was strikingly bipartisan. It was evident that the American people, regardless of political affiliation, desired a more meaningful and informed discussion of constitutional issues in Washington. The American Bar Association, ABA, released a historic statement asking for increased constitutional education for all elected officials, citing the Johnson-Crockett hearing as proof of the need for such training. Even the Federalist Society, a conservative legal organization, complimented Crockett's strict attention to constitutional text and tradition, although ignoring any support of Johnson's arguments. In the days following the hearing, Crockett's office received a deluge of interview requests, speaking invitations, and notes of support from legal organizations across the country. The American Constitution Society invited her to give their annual lecture on constitutional law. Harvard Law School invited her to participate in a conference on the separation of powers. Every major legal institution seemed to want a piece of Crockett, and they sought to elevate her voice in a political climate that frequently dismissed the relevance of constitutional expertise. Meanwhile, Johnson's administration shifted into damage management mode. They issued a series of announcements attempting to explain his errors and provide alternate interpretations of the cases Crockett had trashed. Johnson's team even used complex legal issues and different interpretational frameworks to dodge culpability. But these explanations fell flat. No amount of political spin could obscure the essential fact: Johnson was hopelessly outmatched in constitutional law. The scene was captured on live television for millions of Americans to witness. It could not be undone. The confrontation also sparked a broader discussion on the qualities of political leaders. If the Speaker of the House, allegedly one of America's most powerful persons, could be so ignorant about core constitutional principles, what does this say about the quality of leadership in Washington? Constitutional law academics began advocating for basic competency exams for members of Congress on the very document they swore to defend. While such tests were unlikely to be implemented, the discussion revealed a significant gap in American politics. Crockett's performance showed a serious flaw in the way constitutional matters were handled in Congress, prompting people to re-evaluate what they expected of their elected officials. The international response was similarly stunning. Foreign media sources highlighted the event, portraying it as an illustration of American political dysfunction, as well as a sign of optimism that some American lawmakers still treated constitutional law seriously. The BBC broadcast a program titled, "The Day American Constitutional Law Mattered Again." Meanwhile, German legal scholars commended Crockett's excellent presentation of legal expertise in a political setting, citing it as an example of how legal analysis should be conducted in public debate. The influence of that 15-minute encounter grew over the course of several weeks. Crockett had risen as a national personality, frequently asked to discuss constitutional concerns on prominent news programs. Her legal analysis was widely appreciated for its clarity, precision, and depth. Johnson, on the other hand, experienced a decline in his influence. Republicans began to look to other members for constitutional leadership, undermining his capacity to formulate legal arguments for political objectives. The hearing had become a model for how preparedness, competence, and daring could still influence political discourse. In an era characterized by sound bites and political spectacle, Crockett's careful deconstruction of Johnson's arguments demonstrated that substance might still triumph over style. Crockett's performance inspired many young lawyers and legal students around the country. Applications to public interest law programs increased significantly, with many students citing her as a motivator to pursue careers in public service. The political scene had transformed. The Constitution had been restored to its rightful place at the center of American political discourse, and it was evident that the next generation of legal minds, led by Jasmine Crockett, would not allow it to be corrupted again. The tale became more than just a political event. It served as a reminder of what American democracy may look like if its citizens truly understood the laws they had pledged to obey. The clash between Jasmine Crockett and Mike Johnson will be seen as a watershed point in modern American politics. It was the day when a first-term Congresswoman's constitutional knowledge completely undermined a speaker's political authority. Live on television. Political historians are already comparing it to iconic congressional moments such as Joseph Welch's "Have You No Sense of Decency" encounter with Joseph McCarthy and Anita Hill's testimony, which altered the way America talked about workplace harassment. Aside from the immediate political ramifications, this moment signaled something far more significant. It was more than just a collision of personalities or a struggle of political beliefs. It was proof that education, preparation, and courage still matter in politics. In a period dominated by political spectacle and empty rhetoric, Crockett demonstrated to the world that true skill could nonetheless pierce through the noise and shift the debate. Law schools around the country instantly included the hearing into their constitutional law curricula as a shining example of serious legal analysis in practice. Crockett's genius was more than just a personal success, it was also a beacon for legal education. In the months that followed the hearing, applications to constitutional law programs increased by 40%, with many prospective students citing Crockett's performance as motivation. Crockett's alma mater, the University of Texas Legal School, reported that queries regarding public interest legal professions had doubled overnight, as students aspired to follow in her footsteps. For Mike Johnson, the hearing represented a permanent shift in his political position. He could no longer claim constitutional authority without millions of Americans recalling the day he was repeatedly exposed by someone who genuinely knew the law. Republican strategists privately recognized that Johnson's reputation as a constitutional scholar was irreversibly harmed. The party was compelled to scramble for new perspectives on legal issues. Several major conservative legal organizations have quietly distanced themselves from Johnson's constitutional conclusions. The Heritage Foundation, which has previously hosted Johnson in constitutional law lectures, surreptitiously withdrew his papers from its website. While not directly challenging Johnson, the Federalist Society began to feature other Republican lawyers in their constitutional programming, discreetly undermining the speaker and emphasizing the party's split on constitutional matters. For Crockett, the consequences were nothing short of explosive. Her performance at the hearing elevated her to national fame as a serious legal intellect and brave defender for constitutional ideals. She had demonstrated that a newbie with genuine expertise could take on the most powerful people in Washington and win. Following her stint in Congress, book publishers approached her with offers to co-author constitutional law texts, and prominent law firms courted her for future partnerships. What began as a single dispute in a hearing room quickly grew into a career that promised to transform the way constitutional law was perceived and practiced in the political arena. The hearing room, now unoccupied, had gained historical significance. It communicated a clear message: the Constitution is still relevant in American democracy. Expertise remains valuable. And often the most impactful political moments do not come from sound bites or great gestures, but from one individual who understands the law stepping up and telling the truth, regardless of the political ramifications. What were your thoughts on Crockett's constitutional masterclass? Do you think politicians should have to demonstrate genuine knowledge of the Constitution they swear to uphold? The consequences of this event go far beyond a single hearing. This is about the basic foundation of how our democracy works, and whether expertise is still relevant in politics. Share your opinion in the comments section below. Do you think more lawyers like Crockett should run for office? Will Johnson's disgrace force other politicians to read the Constitution before citing it? We'd like to hear your thoughts on this historic moment. Don't forget to sign up for more coverage of the times when political daring meets constitutional knowledge. Turn up your notification bell because we're following every development in this story, from Johnson's damage control efforts to Crockett's growing prominence in constitutional debates. Because in times like these, we need more leaders like Jasmine Crockett who aren't afraid to speak truth to power, especially if that power is in the speaker's chair. Click the subscribe button and share this video with anyone who believes that constitutional knowledge should be valued more than political rhetoric. The Constitution demands defenders who truly comprehend it. And Americans deserve leaders who understand the distinction between legal arguments and political talking points. This is only the beginning of what may be a significant shift in how constitutional law is debated in Congress. With professionals like Crockett leading the effort, We may finally see an end to politicians who treat the Constitution as a political tool rather than the supreme law of the land. Subscribe now to ensure you don't miss a single moment of the constitutional revolution.